me when you're ready. Hello, my name is Lara Kiswani, and I am the Executive Director of AROC, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and a big fan of all our wonderful speakers today. On behalf of the Bay Area World Without Walls Coalition, I'd like to welcome you to our event. Given the topic of discussion, abolition and liberation, which aims to unpack the violence and resistance to the systems used to exercise state repression and inhibit people of color and poor people's self-determination, we want to start by honoring the histories of resistance and struggle for Indigenous sovereignty and acknowledge we are all on stolen land, whether it be the colonization of the Indigenous people of Native America or the colonization of Palestine. The World Without Walls Coalition recognizes the joint struggles for justice and liberation against exploitation, expulsion, and exclusion. The coalition came out of a call in 2017, where Palestinian and Mexican activists issued an invitation to the international community to stand together and challenge border walls. Since then, each year we hold an event to deepen solidarity and take collective action. Today, these issues are ever more pressing, with rebellions across the United States unmasking the violence of racial capitalism and policing. The whole world has come to question the foundations of this system, the historical exploitation and dispossession of Black and Indigenous people. Just as this system finds its origin in the exploitation of Black and Indigenous communities, it is also true that it finds its undoing in the centuries-long emancipatory visions of these same peoples. Understanding the intersections at which George Floyd lived and died, at which so many poor and working people across the world live and die, whether they deal with the long legacy of anti-Black racism, racialized impacts of this current pandemic, Israeli settler colonialism, US imperialism, or otherwise, helps us understand what needs to be torn down and what needs to be built up. Furthermore, understanding that when Black lives matter, everybody's liberation is possible, opens up potential for deepened solidarity. African anti-colonial fighter and leader in the liberation of Mozambique, Samora Machel once said, "Solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains towards the same objective. The foremost of these objectives is to aid the development of humanity to the highest level possible." That is what today's conversation is about. The joint struggle of mass movements, the hard, unrecognized work of coalitions and base-building organizations, the thankless work more often than not done by women and gender non-conforming people, whose names we may never know, who have imagined and made possible another world where people can live in their dignity and thrive towards that fullest potential that Samora spoke of. So when we talk about abolition and liberation today, I invite everyone to ground themselves in that movement history. Let's understand our liberation and our future as being bound together. After all, we are not simply trying to create discussions about racism. We want to dismantle it. And abolition provides us a practical framework, a vision and practice towards that end. I will end by quoting Reverend Eric David Carlson of the Bradford Community Church in Kenosha in response to the protest for justice for Jacob Blake. "While we are relieved that our church home mostly survived the inferno in the lot next door, we affirm that we would rather lose 100 buildings than one more life to police violence." Some folks have already commented that our decision to display Black Lives Matter on our road sign in some way contributed to the fire, or that our support of the BLM movement is hypocritical or unchristian. Indeed, all lives do matter to us, but given the overwhelming, disproportionate injustice suffered by Americans of color, we are compelled by our faith to speak up and affirm that Black lives matter too. If this is not your faith, so be it, but it is most certainly ours, and we ask that all folks be respectful in honoring our sacred calling to speak truth to power, protect the innocent, empower the disenfranchised, and promote equity and compassion in human relations. On that note, I would like for you all to join me in welcoming our amazing speakers today. Today, we have with us Dr. Angela Davis, who has been an activist and liberatory scholar since the 1960s. Her 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete? laid the strategic groundwork for the current abolition movement, as did the first Critical Resistance Conference, which she co-organized in 1998. We also have Jamal Juma, who's been a leading grassroots organizer since Palestine's 1987 Intifada, a founding member of the Palestinian Agricultural Reliefs Committee, Palestinian National BDS Committee, Palestinian Association for Cultural Exchange, and Palestinian Environmental NGO Network. Jamal is currently the coordinator of the Palestinian Grassroots Anti-Apartheid Wall Campaign and Stop the Wall. And our wonderful moderator, Christian Davis Bailey. Christian is a co-founder of Black for Palestine and a co-author of the 2015 Black Solidarity with Palestine Statement, signed by more than 1,000 Black activists. He was a member of Black Youth Project 100 and Students for Justice in Palestine. Christian is currently working at Palestine Legal and is a member of Left Roots. I'll go ahead and turn it to you, Christian.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's really incredibly exciting how many people are interested in this conversation about abolition and liberation for Black folks, for Palestinians, and for the world. So to those of you who are entering these conversations either on Palestine or on abolition for the first time, we welcome you and invite you into our conversation and into our work for freedom and justice. And for those of you who are old friends and used to these conversations, we also are happy to have you with us as well. I'd like to first extend a welcome and thank you to our comrade Jamal joining us from Palestine, where it's 8:10 in the evening. It always means a lot to have our friends and family who are just dealing with the occupation on the ground every day in conversation with us. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And Dr. Angela Davis, it is an honor to be part of this conversation with you as somebody who has really just blazed trails for us in terms of thinking about prisons and abolition and thinking about transnational solidarity and thinking about the connections between the Black movement and the Palestinian struggle. We are very, very happy to have you with us here today. Thank you for joining. So in order to ground our conversation, there's a few things that I'd like to bring into the space. The first is just a quick word on who I am as the moderator. I am an African-American. I am somebody who can show you a piece of the wood of the shack where my enslaved family lived. This means that I inherit a freedom struggle that is over 300 or 400 years long. I'm also queer. I'm a feminist, a Black feminist, and a socialist. And even though all of these things might be scary to some people at some times, all it really means is that the identities I inhabit or the communities that I'm a part of do not yet know what freedom means, and that I believe in freedom for all people around the world, regardless of who they are or where they come from. So these are the frameworks that I kind of bring into our conversation today. The first area where I'd like to ground ourselves is literally on the land where we are. Anybody, as Laura said, who is in the United States is currently sitting on territory that is stolen from Indigenous people. And depending on where you are, on cities that were built by the labor of enslaved Africans or Africans in under threat of imprisonment or other colonized people from around the world. And so we have a duty and a commitment to bring justice and liberation to those groups. So our conversation takes place in the midst not only of national uprising, a pandemic, the increased occupation or colonization of Palestinian land. It also takes place in Black August, which is a month that Black revolutionaries have set up to honor and observe our martyrs and our prisoners of the last great period of our revolutionary struggle, which was between the late 60s and the 80s. We still have dozens of political prisoners today who are serving life sentences for their sacrifice and contributions to our liberation. And so Black August is a month for Black revolutionaries to ground ourselves in that legacy, to honor their work and to continue and commit ourselves to strengthening our own work for liberation. So if you were able to see just to my right, you would see the window where I have the thinkers and revolutionaries who I've invited into my space this past month. But those are Frantz Fanon, Huey P. Newton, our comrade George Jackson, Angela Davis, James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, Toni Cade Bambara, and June Jordan. All of these people through various ways have influenced and contributed to our struggles in very deep ways. And I hope that you each can start to learn from their legacies if you're unfamiliar with them. So where we are today, and I'm just going to move into a slide. I just want to give some context about how we wound up at this conversation, which in many ways is rooted in events from 6 years ago during the summer of 2014, when at the same time we saw the Israel's massive assault on the Gaza Strip, as well as the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, following the police killing of Mike Brown. So Black Palestinian solidarity isn't new. It's existed for decades, as long as we've had revolutionary and anti-colonial struggles. But this current period has been heavily influenced by the events of 6 years ago, where on August 8th, we saw police kill Mike Brown in St. Louis and leave his body lying in the street for 4.5 hours, which provoked a massive uprising of the people and sparked a resurgence in Black organizing and resistance over the last 6 years. At the same time, we saw Israel's brutal attack on the Gaza Strip, in which over 2,000 people were killed over the course of 51 days. But at this time, we saw Palestinians reaching out in solidarity with the Black struggle, offering advice on, if you inhale tear gas, this is what you put in your eyes to make the effects of it go away. Or if you stand this close to the police, they can't shoot tear gas at you because they would be gassing themselves as well. And so out of this moment, we saw not only solidarity, but that our material conditions of oppression were connected. The very same tear gas that was being used against protesters in Ferguson was being used in Palestine and Egypt and other places around the world, manufactured in the good old United States of America. And so we saw a big resurgence of calls to end racism and solidarity between our two struggles as Black and Palestinian people. A massive convergence in Ferguson and St. Louis. We also saw students, the Black Lives Matter movement, rising up, not only to ask for justice or demand justice rather for Black people, but also incorporating the struggle for Palestinian liberation into that context. We've seen a large development in just many of the leaders of our movements and communities raising the importance of being in joint struggle and solidarity with each other, exemplified through the video that you can search online, When I See Them, I See Us, about Black and Palestinian solidarity. And it is also in this context that Black for Palestine, the organization that I am a part of, was founded. Through a solidarity statement signed by over 1,000 Black activists, artists, scholars, and students, reiterating our unconditional support with the Palestinian struggle and the ways in which we see that struggle as tied to our own liberation. So one of the most important aspects of this statement was the fact that we had participation from 12 current political prisoners at that time, who from behind bars reached out to assert that we also are part of this movement and we stand in solidarity with Palestine. Those people include Ayub Abdul-Alim, a political prisoner since 2014, who refused to become an informant for the FBI. It includes people like Kevin Rashid Johnson, political prisoner and Minister of Defense for the new African Black Panther Party. Keith Washington, who reports on abuses within the Texas prison system. Mumia Abu Jamal, who has been incarcerated for decades and is a just outstanding journalist and commentator on not only the state of the prison system, but also of our struggles for justice. Reverend Edward Pinkney, who at the time was a political prisoner in Michigan for his environmental justice activism. Comrade Robert Seth Hayes, who was part of the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army, and who unfortunately died in prison last year. Comrade Shaka Zulu of the New African Black Panther Party. Comrade Shayana Love Me, an organizer with Black and Pink, which is committed to liberation for queer and trans prisoners. Sundiata Akoli, who is the comrade of Assata Shakur and a member of the Black Liberation Army, and a few others. And so I just wanted to read their names to bring these people into the space because we're talking about abolition, we're talking about people's lives. And we're talking about the fact that people who stand up for freedom can be incarcerated for 20, 30, 40, 50 years or their entire lifetimes. So just as we move into our conversation, there are two last names I'd like to just center. The first is Josh Williams, who is a political prisoner of the Ferguson movement, who has been incarcerated who should not be in prison, essentially for being part of the Ferguson uprising. I want to bring in my comrade Mace Abu Ghosh, who is a 22-year-old Palestinian journalism student who exactly a year ago in this moment was experiencing her last moments of freedom. At 4 in the morning on August 29th of last year, the Israeli occupation forces raided her home, imprisoned her, kept her without charge or trial, and tortured her over a series of weeks and months. Mace is still in prison. She's one of 41 Palestinian women who are in prison, and one of dozens of Palestinian students and thousands of Palestinians who are in Israeli jails. And so, as I said, we're talking about the lived experiences of real people who are currently suffering behind bars and who we have a responsibility to liberate from those prisons as we seek freedom for ourselves. So as we move into a conversation with Angela and Jamal, I just want to encourage everybody to have an open mind, to really think deeply about your own, the false assumptions we have about the prison system, about police, about Palestine, and about why any of these forms of repression are quote unquote necessary. So I would like to start with a question that comes from a revolutionary activist in Detroit by the name of Grace Lee Boggs. Grace, every time she encountered people young or old, politically developed or not, would ask the question of people, what time is it on the clock of the world? This is a way of kind of understanding where are we in the grand history of our freedom struggles? What are the particularities of the moments that we're in right now? And what is our responsibility in this moment to continue movements towards freedom? So I'd like to just open up to you first, Angela. Any opening thoughts that you have, but also to get your answer to the question, what time is it on the clock of the world for us here in the Black struggle and for the world more broadly?
Well, first of all, good morning or good evening in Palestine. I'd really like to thank all of the sponsors, co-sponsors of this amazing event, World Without Walls, Middle East Children's Alliance, and it's wonderful to finally meet you, Christian. I've been following your work for many years now, it seems, I guess since you were a student at Stanford, right? Well, and thank you again for evoking Grace Lee Boggs. She is someone whose legacy we really have to hold on to, particularly during this period. And you know, I would say that it's very important in attempting to understand where we are now to accustom ourselves to thinking more regionally and globally, that we Black people here in the United States are connected to Black struggles all over the Americas. As we engage in discussions about political developments in the US and struggles against racism spearheaded by Black people, it's so important to acknowledge that the United States of America is not the only place in this region where Black people have been struggling for justice. We follow in the path that was carved out by the Haitian Revolution, by struggles all over the Caribbean and Brazil and Uruguay. And then of course, we focus very specifically this morning on the relationship between struggles in Palestine and Black struggles in the US. But regarding the question, what time is it? I think that may I take a couple of minutes? Okay, that we should think about this moment as a conjuncture. I like Stuart Hall's conjunctural analysis. And And it's a conjuncture of various processes. First of all, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which revealed the extent to which indigenous, Black, and Latinx communities have been overexposed to the virus due to structural factors, including the racism of the healthcare system and the resulting pre-existing conditions among people of color. And precisely at a time when increasing numbers of people were recognizing that racism acquires its apparent permanence, not because of individual attitudes, but because of economic and political and social structures. Precisely at that moment, we were presented with dramatic and indeed lethal examples of racism embedded in the structures of policing. Of course, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, racist police violence has always been accompanied by racist vigilante violence. And of course, we've seen, aside from the case of Ahmaud Arbery, we've seen other examples of that, most recently in Kenosha. Now, the third factor, which I think is perhaps the most important that we often underestimate, is the ongoing grassroots community organizing over the years. And of course, Grace Lee Boggs participated in that. And this included an extraordinary intellectual and cultural and labor investment over years and even over decades. And I think this was the determining factor. This is what made it possible to respond immediately to this convergence. And in this context, I wouldn't discount the work of musicians and filmmakers and other visual artists, and of course the leadership in the sports community. And then finally, let me say that the anti-racist, anti-capitalist internationalists, and especially the pro-Palestinian stance and the feminist dimension as well of our organizing over the years have been particularly important. And this has led to an increasing popularity of abolitionist analyses over the last 20 years, all of which is to say, you know, what time is it? It's a moment of hope, not only for Black people and communities of color in the US and Palestine, but all over the world.
Thank you. So Jamal, I present a similar question to you. What time is it on the clock of the world in Palestine? And maybe in addition to that, for folks who are for the first time learning of Palestine or getting familiar with the context, in a nutshell, what is the essence of the struggle for freedom in Palestine?
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Christian, and all other comrades on the organizing this. And it's my honor also to be with Angela Davis and this panel as well. First of all, good morning to you, comrades, and good evening to the Palestinians, to Palestine here. In terms of what we are facing now and what we are at now, we are dealing with the Trump, what's so-called deal of the century, what we called it the steal of the century. In fact, since 2017, when Trump came to the power, they start like the joint Israeli-American plan to liquidate Palestine issue. And they get it in steps seriously, from recognizing Jerusalem as a capital of Israel to targeting the right of return for the Palestinians, refugees, to recognize the sovereignty of Israel on the Golan Heights, then to the recognizing the colonies and the settlements in the West Bank. That's end up with what's so-called the annexation plan of the West Bank, which is in fact part of the plan of Trump that has been maybe a little bit, the announcement itself has been delayed, but on the ground they are going fastly into this annexation practically by organizing and building a new colonies in the West Bank, but we call it outposts near to the Palestinian groves and Bedouin communities, as they targeted the Jordan Valley to be evacuated and annexed to Israel, the apartheid state. This came in fact, this came at the same time, which is a part of the plan, what they are trying to organize in the Middle East, the normalization with the Emirates, which is, I think it started from Washington, which is reorganizing the whole Middle East, in fact, like to be led by Israel, to be the police of the Americans in the Middle East. And the one who's paying the price for this will pay the price is the Palestinians. Because now the serious talks within the Palestinian political regime, what we can do. Clearly, we are living in a moment like where, when in the last days of Yasser Arafat, where clearly that there's a plans coming to the area where where Arafat disappear or they killed Yasser Arafat, in fact. So now the authority or the Palestinian leadership is expecting same things going on, especially with this Emirates, Israeli new normalization. That's clearly it will be followed by other Arab collaborated country that followed the angle of the American Israel in the Middle East. So the options that they offer, like or they were discussing, in fact, either to go to the United Nations and to tell them, okay, this is Palestine cause, and we don't know that, or you are in a way or another responsible over the Palestinian people, which is in fact, as we see it as a Palestinian, it's a wrong option. The other option that they are discussing is the handing what, as they call, the keys to Israel, meaning that call the occupation back again to the West Bank, which is in fact also another wrong choice. What we say as a popular movement is the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership, in fact, they didn't get to the right solution, the right choice, which is the people. The revolution, the Intifada, that's what should be happened. But there is a gap between the people and this, and our, unfortunately, our leadership at the moment. That doesn't mean that we are like waiting. Every day the struggle is going on the ground. Every day the people demonstration. Every day they are arresting people, confiscating the land. People going to the streets. More villages joining the struggle. So the struggle is going on. And here I would go and say that what we are facing today is a accumulation of over a century of settler colonialism. That's our issue. That's our deep issue as a Palestinians. It is a European imperialist project, colonial project in the Middle East, which started with, they based it in Palestine itself to keep the fragmentation of the Middle East after the First World War. And we are the Palestinians who's paying this very heavy price. So since then, the British has been promised the Zionist movement, a homeland in Palestine. They start bringing waves of immigrants to Palestine, settling them on the Palestinian lands. That's ended up in 1948, what we call the Nakba, where 72 of our historical Palestine has been occupied. 85% of our people there has been wiped out, has been ethnically cleansed from their land. Most of their villages and cities has been destroyed, leveled to the ground, 530 villages. 90% of the Palestinian land has been confiscated and transferred to what's so-called Jewish National Fund, which is like one of the biggest robbery funds that taking the Palestinian lands and distributing it to the new settlers. But since then, since that time, the Palestinians never stopped their resistance. What's our goals over there? What do we want as a Palestinians? Simply, we want, like any other people under occupation, lost their freedom. We are struggling for self-determination, for freedom, for the right of return for our people. That over 60% of our people are living in the diaspora and the refugee camps. So this is our main, and against colonialism, racism, and apartheid that has been formally formed from the beginning. Israel, since it has been established in 48, it was an apartheid state, and it has been established as the model of the South African that time, building with the supremacy of the European settlers over the indigenous of the country. Some very important, I would say, secret in the Palestinian struggle. Why the Palestinians didn't give up until now? The thing is about the connection of the Palestinians with the land. How deep this people is connected. If you go to any refugee camp in Lebanon, Syria, If you go to any Palestinian in the diaspora that is living since 70 years there, educated their kids and their families, generations, and they draw a map in their minds of their land, the number of the trees, how much dunams. So it has been connected deeply in there. We read our history through and of ancestors also through the land, through the stones there, through the age of the olive trees, that some of them goes back to 1,000 years or more. This connection, maybe it has been translated with some stories to us, like any that we are facing on the ground, where like in one case, like any the soldiers, when they built the wall, they were coming to a family there, and they destroy part of a house of a farmer there, and also he has small nursery there. They destroy it, and they want to destroy the house, and the man was putting his head on the ground. And the soldiers was like astonished and was surprised. What are you doing? Are you get crazy? Are you fall unconscious? He told them, no. I'm just listening to what the land talked to me. So they start laughing. Are you crazy? No, he said, exactly. You are the crazy. You don't know this relation. The land told me, don't worry. As much as you are deeply rooted in me, nobody can uproot you. So he started laughing at them. Do whatever they want. You do whatever you want. So this is the secret of the connection that the people have. The same with the Bedouin communities in the Jordan Valley, the villages that they had been targeted daily by confiscating land. Many have been killed when they are going to pick their olives and to deal with their land. So this is in general, what can I describe about this? So, and this is the critical moments that our struggle is a survival. We are standing up, and what, as Angela ends, I think it's a moment of hope. We never lost the hope. The hope is always there. And why we are continue? Because we always have the hope. We never gave up the hope.
Thank you, Jamal. And I'm glad that you and we each have some degree of hope, because it is a moment that can feel very full of despair. But it is only this shred of hope that kind of keeps our movements moving forward. So whatever we can do to cultivate that, we all need to be doing that. And just to speak a moment on the similarities I see between our conditions and structures, what we're dealing with as Black folks and as Palestinians is living under colonialism. Of having outside forces decide that they either want our land or control of our bodies and our labor, and will utilize their own power and domination to maintain that. So in a very kind of similar process to how the United States pushed indigenous people off of their land over 400 years, that's what Israel is doing to the indigenous Palestinians, who are also experiencing or falling under a system of racism and apartheid. So we'll speak more about these connections as we go forward, but I just wanted to kind of bring that in. So I want to turn to just the conditions of prison or the prison industrial complex in the United States. I'll be reading just a quick quote from our comrade George Jackson, who was one of the most brilliant revolutionaries and martyrs of our struggle, who was killed in a prison uprising in 1971. But he writes while he's in prison, "The masses must be taught to understand the true function of prisons. Why do they exist in such numbers? What is the real underlying economic motive of crime and the official definition of types of offenders or victims? The people must learn that when one offends the totalitarian state, it is patently not an offense against the people of that state, but an assault upon the privilege of the privileged few." And so just with this in mind, this question of what is the function of the prison in our society, I'd like to turn to you, Angela, to just give us an overview of the prison industrial complex.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jamal, for that analysis. And thank you, Christian, for evoking George Jackson. His work reminds us that the analysis and theories with which we work today emerged from prison intellectuals, there is a field that we call critical prison studies, that university field, an academic field, that would not have been possible without the contributions of people in prison, people like George. Police and prisons provide us with dramatic legacies of settler colonialism, slavery, and capitalism. And of course, many of us understand that police and prisons have never been designed to protect and serve all of the people, but in a class society, in a society that thrives on racism and heteropatriarchy, it is clear that police and prisons are designed to maintain the status quo. And it seems as if we've continued over the years, over decades, over centuries to try to make these institutions more democratic, to try to make them serve everyone. But they are structurally biased. They are precisely designed to protect affluent, mostly white people. And this will not change no matter how much we tinker with these institutions. And I think that the connection with Palestine, the emergence of a powerful Palestine solidarity movement has helped our movements in this country to mature, to develop deeper and more complex analyses. It has given us the courage to be more upfront about abolitionist approaches and specifically recognizing the ties between the Israeli military and US police departments helped us to understand that we couldn't simply call for the prosecution of individual police officers, but rather that we needed to begin to challenge the very structures of policing, including the militarization of the police, emanating in part from the impact of the Israeli influence. In other words, our analysis not only had to account for, one might say, genealogies of prisoning in the US that take us back to the violent usurpation of indigenous land and the violent control of forced African labor, but also recognizing the part racial capitalism has played in policing and incarceration. And because racism is never static, never unchanging, contemporary racism, whether directed against Black communities or Latinx and indigenous communities or Asian communities, this contemporary racism incorporates and builds on global Islamophobia. And Palestine solidarity has taught us precisely about the importance of a more complicated understanding of policing and imprisonment, and the importance of anti-imperialist approaches. Let me just say that, as I made this point before, that we keep trying to make these institutions more democratic. We keep trying to guarantee that everyone will receive equal treatment, but they are structurally biased. And for people who think that the police can be reformed, the question needs to be posed. Why do we keep experiencing the same thing over and over? Why could the police in Kenosha not restrain themselves from shooting Jacob Blake 7 times, even though they must have certainly known that the world would be watching? In a sense, you might say, they see policing as keeping the world safe from Black people. And looking at Palestine, it makes no sense to argue that all we have to do is say, just reform the Israeli army, reform the Israeli military police. That makes no sense in that context. And I think we're learning that the same thing applies to the United States.
Thank you, Angela. And I just want to lift up two pieces of your work for people to engage with. The first is your most recent book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Written shortly after our last iteration of Black Lives Matter protests, but among the messages you bring home in that book are the need to understand that racism is not just about an individual idea, that we need to have an understanding of the structural violence of the state, and understand how we challenge racism not just symbolically, but on this level of structure, and that our freedom is more expansive than just civil rights. It's not a matter of just, okay, you get some rights and now we're free, yay. It's much bigger than that. The other book I recommend that people read is called Are Prisons Obsolete, which is a very short and really excellent summary of how prisons in the United States came to be the way that they are. But if we look at the transition from slavery into the moment after, convict labor, forcing Black people to work on plantations or farms for money, replaced slave labor. And if we look at the prison system today, many corporations around the world use prisoners as free or very cheap labor, from Verizon to I think Dove soap to really just almost any corporation you imagine, Victoria's Secret. So there's a kind of continuation of slavery through the prison system that it needs to be rooted out. So Jamal, I'd like to turn to you and to understand, just some people, they might look at the occupation and say, oh, well, it kind of makes sense. Like the Israelis, they need to like take care of themselves and protect their security. Can you talk us through why that's not actually the case of what the situation is?
And I want to thanks first for Angela for the analysis about the prisons. Something especially about the Palestine, when we talk about the prisons, is like to destroy the Palestinian resistance. And this has been, in fact, used systematically in different ways. The actual prisons, we have since 1967 until now over 1 million Palestinians imprisoned since that time. We are talking about a population, total population of 5 million. So 1/5 of the population. You don't find even a house that there is no prisoner from the house was in the prison. But even go beyond that, it's not just imprisoning individual, but imprisoning also the communities by itself. Like Gaza, how you describe Gaza? Gaza is the biggest open air prison in the world. The same, how they fragment the Palestinian people and prison them. Jerusalem today is encircled by 181 kilometers of walls. The West Bank now, it's creating with this apartheid system and a prisons. North ghetto, middle, south, so many enclaves around. It's also prison, fragment the people to kill them, to kill their resistance. The other thing that they were targeting also is killing the resistance inside the people by the prisons through generations. And here, I would say that this started even practically in the last 10 years, where they targeted the children. In Silwan, one community, in 1 year, they arrested 1,000 child. We're talking about from 8 years old until 16 years old. Taking them to jail, harass them, torture them, terrifying them, release them after 2 weeks and chasing them at home. Keep attacking their homes, asking about them, to destroy a generation, in fact. And this has been used in Hebron as well and several other places. If you talk about defending themselves, who's defending himself here? Who's the one under attack? Who's the one who needs protection? Is it the settlers in the West Bank that there is over 60,000 settler militarized, armed and trained, and they are attacking Palestinians, killing them, shooting the farmers, burning the mosques, burning the cars, and this? Who is the Palestinians? All what they are doing is defending themselves. When the Palestinians go out in the streets, they go out against house demolition. They go out to defend their existence, their communities. So this is the way that they are trying to use to criminalize the Palestinians. We are the poor. We want to defend ourselves. In fact, we are the one who's defending, and they are the one who's attacking. And if you look at the history, like when you talk about Palestinians now not controlling more than 13% of their homeland, indigenous homeland. So we are the unsystematic attack of ethnic cleansing, which goes along with massacres that happen systematically against the communities, against Gaza, against refugee camps, against the communities in the West Bank in the last 20, 25 years. So what we have to reverse this one. So the Palestinians are the one who need protection. The Palestinians who are defending themselves and defending their life and the future, in fact, and their next generations to live like normally, like any other people in the world.
Thank you, Jamal, and I really appreciate just your point that it's Palestinians who are defending themselves and who are being attacked. My first time in Palestine was in 2013, and we were going around to different places. We saw the wall, we saw settlements, we saw the checkpoint, and in every case, people would ask, like, what possible justification do the Israelis have for mistreating you in this way? Because it's for their security. Well, 2013, this was the same year that Trayvon Martin was killed by somebody who claimed that he needed to stand his ground to protect his security from a 17-year-old boy. These logics of security tend to focus on security for one group of people, a group of people who tend to be kind of oppressing us, and completely ignore security for our own sake. So I really appreciate you for bringing that in to the conversation. Angela, do you have any thoughts on this, or would you like another question?
Well, I think it's when we're talking about Black Palestinian solidarity, that solidarity is grounded in part on the historical struggles of both peoples, and the fact that there has been this consistent history of struggle, even against all odds. Palestinians have been inspired by Black struggles. Black struggles have been inspired and assisted by Palestinians. And I think that those of us who've been involved in prison abolitionist movements have understood much more clearly, because we have looked at the situation in Palestine, that prisons are not discrete institutions, that they are a part of a continuum of carcerality that often spreads into the community. And of course, in occupied Palestine, and Jamal made the point that Gaza is the largest open air prison in the world. We see the continuum of carcerality that spreads into the communities. We see checkpoints, we see the overt presence of military police. And from this, we have learned in the US that we need not only to challenge prisons as discrete institutions, but we have to stand up against electronic bracelets, against house arrests, and all of the other forms of carcerality that are frequently represented as alternatives to incarceration. Maya Shenwar and Victoria Law's most recent book, Prison by Any Other Name, explores, all of those repressive methods that we see in Palestine that are often represented as reforms, but actually serve to broaden and extend and deepen the impact of carcerality on our society.
Can I ask you to say more about that and talk about just why prison reform is not the answer to this issue?
Well, the history of the institution of the prison is a history of reform. Prisons were introduced as a reform, and throughout the history of the institutions, there have been those who have argued that we can make this a better, more humane, more democratic institution. But each time these reforms are instituted, the institution, the prison, becomes more deeply rooted on the social, political, economic landscape of the country. And I think it's important to point out that it was the United States of America that was the site of the original argument that prisons should serve as the most effective effort to address harm in our community. And in a sense, it was through colonialism, et cetera, that this institution gets introduced to the world. It's, and just as we ought to accustom ourselves to remembering that capitalism is a historical phenomenon. It came into being through history. It is not a permanent aspect of human life on the planet. We can move beyond capitalism. We can overthrow capitalism. The same thing applies to the institution of the prison. We can develop new and more effective ways of addressing harm in our community. Our system of so-called justice does not have to be grounded in racist repression. And so therefore, it gives us the opportunity to think about how it is we can really keep our community safe. What do we need to keep our community safe? We need jobs, we need housing, we need education, and all of those issues that are often marginalized when we simply talk about prison reform. We don't want to remain within the footprint of that institution. We want to radically reorganize society in such a way that does not mean that we will require prisons in the future. And Palestine has been a great inspiration in the development of these ideas.
Thank you.
I think it's about...
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I think it's about removing this oppression systems, like this racism, this apartheid systems. That's the solution. That's where we have to go up to. This is the demand should be. And if this is like not racist, we will have, as a Palestinians, we will have much better life, the same as the Black. I mean, what Angela was talking about, from all these needs to these communities to be safe, is all these needs that they need, from education, from health, from medical treatment. So that's where the point. And this is very connected to the capitalism, to the imperialism, which has been go over not just Palestine and the United States, but over so many countries around the world.
Thank you. And just for those who are listening and have questions on Zoom, please insert your question in the Q&A part of the Zoom app. In a few minutes, we'll go through them and summarize and pick from a few. But I'm not able to track the questions if they're just in the general chat for the group. Yeah, and so you each kind of preempted my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Does abolishing police, abolishing prisons, abolishing the occupation mean that we are free as Black people or as Palestinians? If the occupation ends tomorrow, is there a free Palestine? And if not, what do we need to be doing after the point of abolition to ensure our freedom?
So Jamal, do you want to take on this question first?
I think what we are facing is not occupation. It's settler colonialism. It's targeting the existence of the people. And here, like if you want the Palestinian freedom, you have to end up the cause, which is the Zionism as a colonial ideology. This is the one that can bring real peace to the Middle East and to the Palestinians particularly, and to the Israelis, to be honest. Like, if they have been liberated from Zionist colonial colonial ideology, this will bring them down to think of the others, of the Palestinians as a people, and we can start talking about equality and about reform again. So it is mostly about this, and this is what we need to describe. Occupation is not the right word for what we are facing in Palestine today.
And of course, freedom is not a discrete point in history. I think freedom is a process, and abolition helps us to understand discrete issues such as policing and incarceration, and within a more holistic context. So we see police and prisons as the most public face of state violence, whether here in the US or in Palestine. And I think that in both instances, we are referring to radical social, political, economic transformation. We are referring to processes. And I think that Jamal, in pointing out that the end to the occupation will not necessarily bring about freedom. There are more substantive goals that will be necessary in order to carve out the influences of settler colonialism, of militarism, and of course to move beyond capitalism. But let me say that I think feminism plays an important role here. And this is something that I don't think we've yet mentioned in the conversation, have we?
We're here now.
Okay, so I think that when we speak about abolition, we're actually talking about a feminist approach to abolition, or what some of us have called abolition feminism. Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, Gina Dent, and I are trying to finish a book, a collaborative book that is called Abolition Feminism Now. And so the argument there is that we have to think holistically. We have to think about radical transformations to the society, which will be a process. We have to recognize that feminism is not simply about assimilating women into a context that does not change, just as racism is not about bringing previously marginalized groups into structures and institutions that continue to do that work. But rather we have to talk about deep and expansive, radical transformations. And in my reflections on the nature of freedom, I have come to the conclusion that freedom is not an endpoint, that we will never reach the moment when we're able to say, oh, all struggles are now relegated to the past, but that we will constantly recognize new dimensions of freedom. And in Palestine, of course, the role of food justice is so important. The ways in which Palestinian land has been usurped, and now the effort to annex so much of the small portion of Palestine that is now allocated to people who have the historical claim to that land. That we'll be talking about food justice and animal issues, and there are all kinds of ways in which we will probably be carrying on our struggle for freedom in the future.
You know, Christian,
Go ahead, Jamal.
if
And we'll
you
move.
allow me, just like building on what Angela was
Please.
talking about, I think we have, each of us as a people in different countries, they have a rich history of struggle. But until now, like, we didn't able to connect our struggles together and join it together actually on the ground. I think this is the way where we can win. Maybe like South African, like 25 years ago, win, but this is like it is, and this their winning was for every one of us, for us as Palestinians, for African Americans, for all other people around the world. But how we can, the question is how we can really bring our struggle together, globalizing our struggle, connecting strongly our struggles together and build on it. This is the secret. This is where the movement has to work strongly on, and we have to understand that. If you look at the other side, what's happening now in the Middle East is a very good example. You know, this imperialism and colonialism, colonialist countries, you know, they are hitting us deep in the heart. Now the main questions: do we have Arab Spring? Is it Arab Spring? But why it ended like this? It's not because it is not a revolution. It's not people standing up for their rights and they start going to the streets. But it's the fact that they were able to just destroy the people's revolutions. And now it's like we became doubted our struggles, whether it's right or not. Did we did it in the right way or not? But again, it's fragmented. It's not brought together. We didn't bring the lessons all together and support each other directly in the right way for each of our struggle. The same struggle you have there, we have it in Palestine, and they have it in Iraq, they have it in Afghanistan, they have it in Libya, in Syria, in Latin America, in Brazil now, in Colombia, and several other places in the world. So the challenge for us all is how we can come together. Like, there is an attempt by the Palestinians, like in World Without Walls is one of an example, one of attempts that we were trying to do this connection. Hey guys, like, walls around the world is not just in Palestine. It's in 70 countries around the world and the same goals of oppression. So let's come together, like in Palestine, in United States, Mexico, in Latin America, in the favelas, in Iraq, in several other places, in Kashmir, and several other places where we are facing the same. This is the idea. This is what we have to build on. Boycott, divestment, and sanction is another plan. We should think of it for each and every struggle in the world. How we can punish, how we can make these criminals complicit.
Thank you, Jamal. And I think we are in this moment of bringing our struggles together. The last 6 years have also been a moment within our movements of elevating the struggles within our communities. So when I was in Black Youth Project 100, that was organizing from a Black, queer, feminist lens of understanding the need to elevate the struggles of women, gender nonconforming, queer and trans people against heteropatriarchy at the same time as we fight racism. And for those who follow my advice and read Angela Davis's work, you will see both in Are Prisons Obsolete and Freedom is a Constant Struggle, exactly how paying attention to the needs of these movements and struggles and parts of our community helps elevate freedom for everybody.
Yeah, but this doesn't mean that I am not recognizing and admiring all what we did as a people together. Like, but I think the moment needs much more. Like, we have to fasten this. It's like there is a lot of things that we did together. We support each other in so many things, all over our history. And 1st of November to 1970, you gave a very strong statement in support of Palestinian struggle that time. So there is a history, there is a big history there. But we are in the moment that we're facing a very advanced imperialist ways of destroying our struggle. That's where we have to advance our connections and support together.
So I'm just looking at our time and needing to move us a little forward. Some of these things will continue to come up in the discussion, but this is a good transition to the Freedom is the Future campaign, which we'll spend a few minutes hearing about from a dear friend and comrade, Sandra Tamari, who is a Palestinian American organizer and director of Abdallah Justice Project, a Palestinian advocacy organization that highlights Israel's discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel. Based in St. Louis, Sandra was active in organizing Palestinian solidarity with Ferguson and continues to focus her work on building joint liberation efforts with peoples at the margins. Sandra will now be offering us a call to from the Invest in Justice for All coalition. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you so much, Jamal and Angela. What a rich conversation. I will keep this short because I want to get to the discussion as much as you all do. I'm really proud that Abdallah Justice Project is part of pushing forward Freedom is the Future and part of a coalition called Invest in Justice for All. The Invest in Justice for All coalition partners include the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, Eyewitness Palestine, Friends of Sibyl North America, Empower Change, and the DSA Working Group on Palestine. We are working very hard to bring Invest, Divest, not only to an abolitionist movement here in the US to bring that forward, but also to talk about how it's connected to the US investment in war and militarism, particularly the $3.8 billion that go to Israel each year to buy the weapons, the systems, the tactics that oppress Palestinians. We believe, as Dr. Davis has taught us, that building justice requires grabbing at the root, requires radical solidarity. And so we believe in this moment of global pandemic, Israeli threats of further land theft, annexation, and this promising moment, this moment of hope to advance a vision of justice for all, that now is the time to demand an end to militarism from the US to Palestine. And it's the beginning of a very strong demand for historic justice for all our communities. So defunding police is not only Black liberation work, it is Palestinian liberation work. When we say defund Israeli apartheid, that is also Black liberation work because these are fronts in the same battle. And we believe that investing in our communities doesn't uplift security for a chosen few, but really does create safety for all people because it's investment in education, housing, and healthcare for all. I invite everyone to visit our website. We have everything in one place for you, freedomfuture.org/take action. There we have 5 actions that you can take today to further this conversation and to take it to action. First of all, we ask that you, when you're talking about Palestine, that you center Palestinian voices. And we have some ideas for Palestinian organizations that you should be following and supporting. And then we have a link to the Right to Narrate conversation that we hosted last week that really goes into depth in the ways that Palestinians have been erased from the conversation about their own future, how that leads to violence and leads to really bad policies, as we're seeing over and over again. We ask that you read Palestinian statements for freedom, including our own Freedom is the Future, which is a vision and policy platform put out by Palestinians in the US last December, really rooted in a collective liberation framework. And inspired by the Movement for Black Lives policy platform and the Red Nations Red Deal. So a real call from Palestinians in the US as an inseparable part of the Palestinian people for collective liberation. The second thing that we ask you to do is learn more through political education, and we have some resources for you there, including the US campaign's Freedom Bound, which is a curriculum on resisting Zionism and white supremacy, and FASNA's Counter Kufi, Christians United for Israel curriculum and actions you can take to fight Christian Zionism. The third thing is a very simple ask. We've set it up for you that you can write to Congress today. You can go to bit.ly/investinjustice2020. And I think Rochelle will be sharing that in the chat and on Facebook just now. This is a form that will allow you to find your congressional representative and demand an end to the $3.8 billion in military funding to Israel each year. And also an analysis that this is connected to defunding our military, defunding our policing systems. Important to remember that about 50% of the US's discretionary spending at the federal level goes to the military, and at the municipal level, about the same amount. Here in St. Louis, about 45% of the municipal budget goes to policing. These are our priorities. We want that to change. That must end. Fourth, we give you some resources on how to get connected to boycott campaigns, to support BDS, get involved in local Palestine solidarity. And finally, we have a list of really excellent graphics that explain how to be in radical solidarity with Palestinians and really talk about the struggle for Palestinian liberation is an abolitionist struggle. Thank you for recognizing that, Angela, and for lifting that up. And for us to understand that freedom isn't the end of the road. We really are talking about a decolonial process. And one of the graphics talks about this is not about a state, this is not about a need for a new state. States are not guarantors of freedom. They're not guarantors of security and safety for people. What we need is a new vision. And what we hope to do is to spark a radical reimagining of what the future can be. And we are inspired by the people that have come before us, the people we stand on the shoulders of. And I will close just by saying we want you. We want you to be part of this movement. We want you to be part of this struggle for collective justice. So please fill out the exit card that's being posted now. This will ask a few questions and allow you to plug in to the different parts of this campaign. And thank you so much for the time, Christian.
Thank you, Sandra. And I hope everyone will check out these really important campaigns and plug in, because this is the moment we really need people to support however they can to boost our movements. So we have a hard stop in 14 minutes. We also have 41 questions. We obviously are not getting to most of those, but what I will do is read out a few. And then Angela and Jamal, if you want to consider these in the context of closing remarks, you can touch on whatever kind of speaks to you. So we have questions about how do we abolish the world's largest prison, the Gaza Strip? How do we build conversations around Black Palestinian solidarity into our communities, and how do we strengthen that work? How do you respond to the question that abolitionists get? Well, if we abolish prisons, what do we do with people who commit crimes? What else is here? What specific demands can we make around abolition on the local, national, or international level? Maybe this one can go in the chat, but if people have books that they recommend to learn more about either abolition or Palestine, people are looking for educational resources. Socialism is a more popular topic now. How do we use this moment to help people understand how our white capitalism is like part of our oppression that we experience as Black and Palestinian people? And I'll just read one or two more, and then I'll hand it over to you two. Can reparations provide a framework for the global freedom struggle? And let's see, hard kind of live reading. Yeah, how can we push back against the military industrial complex and the arms industry that connects both the Black and Palestinian struggles? So hopefully that gave you kind of a range of things to pick from, but Yeah, in general, this will be closing remarks from the speakers. If either of you feel itching to speak first, you can speak.
Well, I guess if it's okay with Jamal, I can begin. Let me say that this is just the beginning of a far more complicated conversation, and it's wonderful. I'm looking at some of the questions, and I see really quite incredible contributions to this conversation. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes, but let me say, since we've been focusing on the impact of Black Palestinian solidarity, I want to make the point that solidarity is not transactional. Oftentimes when we call for solidarity with Palestine, there are the questions, well, what has Palestine done for us? That's not what it's about at all. Although Palestine has done a great deal for us, but we don't engage in solidarity work around struggles with Black and Indigenous people in Brazil, or women in Kurdistan, or Dalit people in India, because we expect something in return, but rather because we inhabit one planet, and we should stand up against further efforts by the Israeli state to annex Palestinian land, because, as Dr. King pointed out, justice is indivisible. I really love that formulation, which has been used, that formulation of internationalism, which has been used a great deal in conversations about relations between Palestinian and Black American activists. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But I also like the Marxian formulation, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And I think it's important to point out the contributions of working class people. We didn't have a chance to evoke the work that radical unions in this country have done to push for solidarity with Palestine. And I happen to see a question by a young student I met in Martinique, and her name is Anais Regina, and she asked whether our ideas of freedom are still based on colonial white lives. If so, how do we deconstruct this biased image of freedom in order to build our own unbiased aspirations? I think that's an important question, because we think within ideological contexts that are presented to us. And of course, many of our visions of what it means to be happy and what it means to experience pleasure come from capitalism. Capitalism has defined in many ways our dreams. And what we have to begin to learn how to do is to be critical at the same time as we recognize that we are complicit. And I think that feminist approaches help us to engage in that more complicated way. We don't have to eschew contradictions. We don't have to choose one thing or the other. We're able to, as Audre Lorde pointed out, recognize the creative spark that comes from working at the heart of contradictions. And since this is my last opportunity to say something, let me point out that we have a long road ahead of us. And Palestinian Black solidarity is really key to our capacity to move forward in the direction of the process of freedom.
Thank you, Angela. Jamal?
Yeah. You know, I think when we talk about solidarity, we have to take it as not a kind of an exchange or like any, I did solidarity with you, you did solidarity with me. It's about our humanity. It's about what we believe in. It's about our ethics. It's about our morals. Apartheid and racism is bad. Either it's in Palestine or in the United States, in Brazil, anywhere in the world. So when I'm standing against it, I'm standing with myself. I'm standing with my struggle. When I go in the fields and demonstrations around the walls, and when I saw the pictures of George Floyd, like any huge graffitis on the walls where the people go there, standing there and taking pictures, take their children even to see it and educating them. They didn't think, this normal people, the villagers, they didn't think what the solidarity in the United States did to us. They look at it as it's their own struggle. When they're standing and sitting in front of the TVs, watching the demonstrations that's going in the streets of the States, this is the thing that gives them the hope. So their hearts and the minds are with what's going on there. So this is what's bringing us together, and this is how we should take it as a people everywhere. So when we think of solidarity, we don't think like any of something that otherwise we will be like any fallen into the capitalism idea, like an ideology. So again, like any if I want to say something at the end, I would say talk about the hope. What we make us until now standing, what make you going to the streets and demonstrating, I think it's the hope. I think it's the deep belief in each one of us that we can do the change, that the right is on our side. That's where our strength is. So when you go on the field in the morning and you're going to see the shepherds goes like with their sheep next to the dangerous areas where the settlements, that they are there, there is the hope. When the people go to pick their olives and they know that might be killed, this is where it gives you the hope. When you say that the children in Hebron, the Shuhada Street, standing in front of the settlers who are heavily weaponed, and they are standing there with their school bags, going and crossing in between them and the soldiers to go to school, this is the hope. This is the strength of the people. Wherever you go in Palestine, you see the colonies has been encircled by so many fences, walls, cameras, patrolling, while the Palestinian people who's unarmed is living in their land in peace in themselves. And this is the hope, and this is the strength that given to us. So we are still have the hope. We have a saying in Arabic, the light came after the most dark parts of the night. So that's what we have to keep in mind all the time when we continue with our struggles.
Thank you, Jamal. And as folks get ready to move throughout the rest of their day, I hope you understand that police, prisons, and occupation are just the start of our struggles for freedom. We spend a lot of time focusing on those things, but it keeps us from actually practicing what freedom and liberation mean to each of us. So we need to figure out how we can get around those barriers. I hope you all understand that even if we ourselves are not in prisons, we live in a society that's dominated by the logic of prison, where we are enclosed or people are enclosing on our land in Palestine, on indigenous land here in the United States, where we as Africans were enclosed in ships and then enclosed in a system of slavery and then enclosed in a system of segregation. All of this is for profit. And so the more that kind of capitalism can enclose in its system of profit, the less freedom we have. So it is our duty in every possible way that we are, is to seek out how to break out of those enclosures, how to break out of the logics of capitalism, and how to actually build and expand freedom for all of our people, whether they're in Palestine or Chicago or Oakland or anywhere around the world. So I'm going to be turning it over to Reverend Deborah Lee to close us out. Reverend Deborah Lee is the Executive Director of the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. She has worked at the intersection of faith and social justice for 25 years in popular education, community organizing, and advocacy, connecting issues of race, gender, economic justice, anti-militarism, LGBTQ inclusion, and immigrant rights. I want to thank you, Reverend Lee, for joining us, and I want to thank you again, Dr. Angela Davis and Jamal Juma, for joining us today for this really great conversation.
I want to thank all of our speakers, Angela, Jamal, Christian, Sandra, for illuminating so much for us today. What time is it on the clock of the world? According to Angela, it is the moment of hope, and to Jamal, a stubborn hope that never dies. Thank you for the wonderful ways that we can learn by holding up struggles side by side with each other. International solidarity is what gives us hope and inspiration, helps us to see with greater clarity the problems that we face here locally in our own communities, and also to see new visions for the future, new dimensions of freedom and justice, new ways we can be whole and fully human, deeper practices of solidarity. We're so grateful for this time that you have spent with us today, our speakers and our attendees today, listening to the witness of those who bear the cruelty and burden of systemic violence. The stories of the organizing by feminists, indigenous people, families from different parts of the world who thirst for human freedom, for self-determination, for the sacredness of the land. Struggles are not exactly the same, but they are connected, and they're shaped by similar tools and forces of violence and dehumanization. And there's a connection between our international policies and our domestic practice, policing internationally and policing here at home. We can see those connections of justice here and justice everywhere. I want to thank particularly the World Without Walls Coalition, which has been chaired by Reverend Allison Tanner, our 12 core sponsoring organizations, and the planning team that is meant to put this event together. A special shout out to the Friends of Sabile North America, FOSNA, for their support in making this technically possible. There are two things that you can do. One of those is to fill out the form of how you can get more involved, and that's going to be dropped in the chat right now. So please fill out that form, because as was mentioned today, it's just the beginning, and this is part of the ways that we are going to become stronger in the future, and by more of these connections and more of this international solidarity. So please fill out the form. It'll just take a minute. And the other ask we have for you is to remember the World Without Walls International Day, which is November 9th each year, celebrated by 70 countries around the world. I know here in the Bay Area, we have been having an event for the last several years. We encourage others to also be involved and have their own local events to lift up the vision for a world without walls, a world without prisons, a world without tear gas, a world without violence, and a world without oppression. From Mexico to Palestine, and for the struggle for Black freedom. I'd like to close out with a prayer from the faith community today. Faith is part of this work of activism, just as artists and organizers and legal scholars are also important in this work. And this prayer comes from Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, who is the chairwoman of our board of the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. She's a feminist and activist rabbi and a teacher of Jewish principles of nonviolence. And here's a prayer of faithful solidarity that I'd like to send us all out with. So please take a breath with me. Let's let what we have heard and felt this morning settle into our bodies and into our hearts. May we leave here with actions to serve as an ongoing public witness to the sacredness of every human being across all borders and bars. Committed to ending the ongoing harms of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, anti-Blackness, and militarism, committed to end the pandemic of racism, committed to an end to Israeli occupation of Palestine according to the principles laid out by the BDS movement, committed to recognize the international nature of our collective work for abolition, committed to build a world without walls, without apartheid, without police violence, without caste systems, without extractive industries that degrade the earth we walk upon and the waters that give life. We honor those who remain sumud, steadfast in the sacred work of liberation, and rejoice in the beautiful trouble that opens the doors of equity and well-being. May the words spoken today guide us down the road to healing and freedom, quickly and in our day. May it be so. Amen, Amin, Ashe. Thank you once again for joining us today.